Hi, Louise. How might lack of knowledge or people's personal opinion towards neurodiversity pose the biggest challenge to safeguarding?
Well, there isn't a quick answer to that one, Chris. At the end of the day, there's we're human beings, as in teaching across the board in education, we're incredibly stressed, incredibly busy. What we want is a host of children to come in, receive the information and the knowledge, take part in the learning, and trot off again. And more often than not, the way that education has gone, it's got to be slick, it's got to be efficient, there's got to be pace. There've all these got tos that are in education, but fundamentally, what we've got in front of us is a whole host of different personalities, and in this case, disabilities. And by not acknowledging, understanding, and receiving proper training in this area, we are kind of putting ourselves in a situation where we're not meeting the needs of that student fundamentally, which can then progress into something like managed transfers, removal from school. And I think ultimately what I would love to eradicate in a heartbeat is this compassion fatigue that educators sometimes have.
Mm.
I'm very busy, let's move things along here. And like I've heard educators saying things like, well, they're putting it on now, or they're just choosing to behave like this now. And for me, that is like the biggest red flag when it comes to safeguarding, because safeguarding goes across the board and it's not just something serious, but it can be something minor like behaviour, which can escalate, which can then lead to real risks, real dangers. And as far as I'm aware, that is part of what safeguarding is all about, is it not?
That's interesting because I've read recently that in year seven, a child with ADHD can have probably about 20,000 more negative comments or experience that from adults than their peers.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on that, and why is that the case?
Yeah, that's is it wrong that that doesn't surprise me? My son has ADHD and presented with it the minute he set foot in education. So in nursery, he drew a picture which was a large triangle with legs, obviously as a person, and a very small box which was him. And I don't know how he did it. He was about three, but the little box was looking up at the big triangle. And I kept it. It's somewhere in this house, but I kept it because for me, it represented that authority, and that authority that must have been telling him off from the get go. Our problems started in nursery and went all the way through to sixth form college. So we've kind of been there and done that. So the 20,000 negative comments is, for me, really not an eyebrow raiser. What is a game changer, though, is that if you've got students coming in year seven, if you know that stat, imagine what the power of positivity could have. Imagine just instead of seeing the negative, popping that to one side for a minute and instead talking about the positives, the strength. I don't mean to say, right, so you ignore poor behaviour and patronise. That's not the deal here. What we're talking about is getting to know the individual, getting to know what makes them tick, and then building up that relationship. It doesn't have to be huge. Like I was working with a boy the other day who's really into fishing. And when we first met, he looked at me with such suspicion. He's in year 11. He was like, why are you being nice to me? And it took 3 weeks for me to convince him that one wasn't the enemy. Two, we could actually relax and have a laugh with one another. And from that, we built up trust. And he looked at me like, I'm the enemy. But by the end of it, just by talking about fishing, being a bit positive, getting to know him, things shifted. So, yeah, that's a shocking stat. But at the end of the day, we've got that power, that control as educators to turn that around. And it can just be the difference between one conversation. Like, in schools, right? There's children that go from one lesson to the next in secondary. And, you know, that student can have a terrible time in geography, but do pretty well in English. And those two teachers might come together, CPD training, staff room, and one goes, oh, he's all right for me. And the other one goes, guys, a nightmare for me. Now, for me, that's a major red flag. What is it that the English teacher's doing that the geography teacher's not doing? Because as far as I'm concerned, the pupil's the same. So what's going on there?
I found a lot of your comments there that actually just quite emotional in respect of like not only the picture that your son drew, but just drawing on my personal experiences that I spent most of my first school, primary school, some parts of secondary school as well, being chucked out of classes quite a lot. Not because I was naughty, it's just because I wasn't able to cope in those lessons. Now to find out that my youngest has been encouraged to have tests for ADHD by his school. Reflecting once again just on personal experience, I realized that the classroom environment wasn't for me. And even though my youngest, he's doing exceptionally well, more so than what I was when I was at school academically, he just needs to either keep moving, he needs to get himself out and about every now and then. The school he's at are brilliant. They give him kind of movement breaks, something I never had. The second I moved, that was it. I was out of the class and I was, called out for being disruptive. So what would you say needs to happen more so now within schools when they're managing or supporting young people with even suspected ADHD?
Right. So but I have an issue with this because I've worked in 7 or 8 different establishments and they all have a certain view of ADHD and the reporting of ADHD. So, in a more recent education setting that I worked in, we were not allowed to say to the student, have you thought about possibly having some neurodivergence? Have you even thought about ADHD? We were not allowed to say that unless the student brought it up first. In another education establishment, I was told categorically, no, don't mention it, don't say it. If you've got any concerns, talk to the Senko. And I've worked in another that said the same thing, but then the Senko would insist that the students had an eye test and a hearing test before anything was done. It's so different across the board. And then, like you mentioned, your son, you've been told by the school that there's maybe something going on there. So for me, the rub is that students don't know. Teachers might have an inkling, but either are or not encouraged to say anything about that. However, if that student, let's say, realise that there may be something, or the parents realise something, they go and they get a GP appointment, they get a referral, guess where the paperwork comes back? It comes back to the school, to the teachers who teach that student, and they are asked, what do you think? Do you think they've got ADHD? Well, I've worked in a school where those who knew about ADHD were ticky tick tick, and those who had no clue about ADHD were like, nah, no, he's just naughty. And I've seen firsthand referrals fall flat on their face because teachers are not trained up on it, yet their expertise is drawn in during the referral process. How is that safeguarding? How is that aligned? It drives me nuts. I don't know whether I answered your question, Chris. I've just gone off on a passion project.
I prefer that. That suits me absolutely fine. Is another point that I think doesn't get spoken about enough is that a lot of the time ADHD can be seen as a boy problem. And I use the term problem very loosely, and obviously we're both on understanding of where our thoughts are with ADHD, having experienced it both ourselves, as probably our listeners are probably going to find out in this podcast. But let's look at what the effect is on girls. I know this is obviously a passion of yours as well. So what are your thoughts on how might ADHD present differently in girls in school?
Yeah, it is a passion project. I did my final project for my master's in psychology on it, and it was close to home because my daughter was diagnosed at 21. I was diagnosed at 51, and my son was diagnosed at 7. So you can see that based on that the symptoms that girls present are they're just not as widely known. I feel like we're at a turning point, though. Social media has run amok with this, and there's a huge number of people talking about ADHD in females, which I think accounts for the number of women going for the later diagnosis. However, we are in danger of making that quite niche as well and saying, oh, perfectionism, friendship issues. And actually, at the end of the day, it's about the individual. It's about how the individual presents. I think when it comes to school, we can probably identify those girls who present the way that boys present. So hyperactive, impulsive, might be disruptive from time to time, and so on and so forth. what we tend to recognise less are the quiet good girls that might start off really well in year 7. By the time puberty hits, either mental health is starting to decline, or they can completely change in their behaviour and become far more disruptive. Now, what that then equals is, oh, she's an attention seeker. She wasn't like this in year 7, so why is she behaving like this now? Biologically, with estrogen, you're more likely to develop more dopamine receptors. So then you really are having a massive shift. And the women that I spoke to for my study, 1 or 2 in particular said, I woke up one morning and went, sod it. I'm not trying anymore. Forget it. This trying and being perfect isn't getting what I need. And they went completely the other way. Truancy, failed all their exams. And every single woman that I interviewed said the same thing. If somebody had stopped and asked them what was going on, instead of assuming that their poor behaviour was something that was completely in their control, it would have transformed their lives.
So let's just go off in a different direction. What are the symptoms or effects of someone who has undiagnosed ADHD in, say, later life, 20s, 30s, 40s?
I think there's a lot of self-recrimination, low self-esteem, misdiagnosis with anxiety and depression. These are really common. It doesn't take very long on the internet to find people who talk about these experiences. But I think with working with older teens in these last few years, I see an awful lot of angst, an awful lot of self-blame. Everybody around me, in comparison, everybody around me can cope with it. Why can't I? Everybody around with me seems to be revising. Why can't I get motivated? And these individuals are just so amazing. The ones I've worked with, so special, learned far more about myself than they've, that I've helped them. And some of them come limping out of secondary school, like they're coming out of the trenches, and trying to access further education for them is so difficult. And then we have the flip side of it, because you have another boost of estrogen sometimes when you're 17 or 18, and they've kind of coped through secondary school, and then all of a sudden they're not coping, and they don't understand why all the coping mechanisms that they used in school are no longer working. So burnout is a real massive risk and possibility.
So what makes someone with ADHD an effective teacher?
Okay, well, there are not many studies on this, but I have a theory. That in most schools, there is a huge number of teachers with undiagnosed or diagnosed ADHD. And for me personally, because I'm the only person I can speak for, is it serves in a number of ways. Number one, you don't have to worry about time because there's bells telling you where to go and where to be. There are tight deadlines, which helps with the motivation aspect, because you're constantly stressed and you're constantly, trying to chase a moving target. So that in itself can, in terms of dopamine, be great. And then my other theory is that I've come across a lot of people in the last 5 years, 10 years, who are motivated by trying to make a difference and trying to change and trying to help people. So the caring industry is probably full of ADHDers too, because it's what gets the juices flowing. So I speak to a lot of young people who got ADHD and they want to go into health and social care. They want to go into teaching. So they want to make a difference. That's what really gets them going. So I think in teaching, the fast pace of it, the stress factor, which can be a good thing for an ADHDer, apart from the burnout side of things, the energy that's required. Yeah, I think it lends itself really nicely to the profession. And I can't tell you how many I meet on a regular basis. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's interesting.
If someone's listening now and they're concerned that they might have ADHD, what symptoms should they be looking out for, and what advice would you give them?
Okay, it's quite a big question. I think if alarm bells are ringing, then it's best to start, I think, just conducting your own research to begin with. And I would probably direct people to somewhere reputable like Additude. So it's ADDITUDE.com. It's research based. It's based in America, but they've got many articles on ADHD, and there's a very thorough questionnaire that people can work their way through. I think it's interesting the number of parents that I meet of young people with ADHD, and quite often my first thought is, I think you may have ADHD as well, but obviously I don't say that, so I'm not very ethical. But I think when you've lived with it for an awful long time, it's you don't consider it. Like, I went through motherhood not thinking for a second it was me. I blame my ex-husband. But it was me all along. And I only learned that doing the study and interviewing women and relating to everything that they were saying. So I think it's worth keeping an open mind, going in there with an open mind as well, like, and maybe going to a GP saying, look, these are the symptoms that I'm suffering with, and going from there. Hopefully it'll just be a straightforward referral, but maybe go to Attitude first. Have a look at things like executive dysfunction list. On there's everything that you may well be struggling with. So organisation, emotional control, timekeeping. That should then lead you into going down a more detailed avenue and hopefully getting that referral and speaking to a specialist, a psychiatrist.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, Louise, if somebody wants to find out more about what you do and any services that you provide, how may they do that?
They may do that by going on my website, the ADHDteacher.co.uk. On there is everything that I do, from case studies to how coaching helps, how mentoring helps, and how you can access my service for training and CPD.
Thank you so much. Well, that's brought us nicely to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much, Louise, for joining us. And what a very interesting topic on ADHD.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for asking me to be on.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the follow button so you don't miss another episode of Safeguarding Redefined. Thank you.